On everybody, welcome on into the FanDuel Waiver Wire Q&A, getting you set to fill out those waiver wire requests as we get set for week number 11 of the 2019 fantasy football season. Get those questions in over on Facebook Live and on Twitter, and we'll try to answer as many as we can here right now. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberfire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason. He is the editor-in-chief of Numberfire and FanDuel. JJ, week number 10 now in the books. We are heading into the stretch run now. How you doing?
I'm good. I am very prepared and ready for Brian Hill season.
Yes, exactly, because Devontae Freeman is expected to miss a couple of weeks now, which means that Brian Hill ascends into a larger role for Atlanta. Now, what we've seen for Atlanta this year, whether it's been, Devontae Freeman and Brian Hill or Ito Smith and Devontae Freeman, it's always been kind of a committee with Atlanta. And we know that they're probably going to face negative game scripts, but Brian Hill is a running back moving into volume in a situation where a lot of teams need that. So how hard are you going at Brian Hill on waiver wires right now?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that, there's going to be a lot more scenarios down the stretch here where you're going to get a running back off the wire who could be a pseudo workhorse, someone who's going to see at least, maybe in this past game, he saw 65% of Atlanta's running back rushes. I think that we could project him to be around there, maybe even the 70% range or even higher because Dan Quinn came out and said that they trust Brian Hill to be able to handle the workload there. So I think you can go fairly hard. The problem is that Atlanta as a team, they ranked 26th in the NFL this season in fantasy points scored as a team running back group. So the team itself and the situation itself isn't as attractive as you might think. But I do think that he's the top waiver wire ad this week. And they get Carolina too. A team that hasn't been able to stop the run very well at all, despite having a good defensive line. So I'm into Brian Hill as an ad. Depending on FOB at this point of year is kind of all over the place because a lot of people have spent a lot of it, and it depends where your league is at. But if you're looking at a total of $100, I think going at about 20-ish% makes sense for Brian Hill because you know that there's a chance that Devontae Freeman does come back in a couple weeks, which would make Brian Hill more of a secondary option. But I will say Brian Hill's not a bad running back. If you look at what he did in college and his prospect profile coming out, he had a really good college dominator rating, which is something that I look at a lot. I don't necessarily look at dominator rating itself, but I look at the pieces that go into dominator rating. He had good college production, and he's a fairly athletic back. So I think that he's a reasonable player, and it's not like Devontae Freeman has looked like his old self this year. So I wouldn't be shocked if Brian Hill, he has a couple of games where he sees massive workload with Devontae Freeman's sideline, but he could probably carve out a decent sized role with Ito Smith out.
I think, too, it's worth noting that Brian Hill entered this year with kind of an uphill battle to make the roster because they had Freeman, they had Ito Smith, they drafted Quadri Olison, and he played well enough to earn a spot on this roster, which I think shows you that he has talent and that this coaching staff does believe in him, which I think bodes well for Brian Hill. And who are we to turn down volume in week 11 of fantasy football? First question here from Facebook Live. Jason Charles Line wants to know, is Saquon worth trading a lot for down the stretch? Saquon Barkley looked pretty banged up, but now gets a bye week. The offensive line was missing its left tackle, center, and right tackle, which are the three most important positions on Sunday. But those guys should be back after their bye week. So what are you doing with Saquon Barkley after a really disappointing week number 10?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could consider him a buy candidate, mostly because he's on a buy this week. So you know that you might be able to get him a little bit cheaper if the person who has Saquon in your league is struggling a little bit and they need a win. But if you look at weeks 15 and 16, which are the fantasy playoffs, obviously week 14 in a lot of leagues as well, but 15 and 16, they get Miami and Washington. Those are two teams that not only are beatable on the ground, but at the same time, the Giants could see a positive game script against those teams, which is not something that we say very often about the New York Giants. So given those matchups and given the fact that Barkley's coming off a down game, he has a bye, I think now is a decent buy low moment for him.
And Saquon Barkley's had a really good passing game involvement, and I think that should stick even when they do get guys like Evan Engram back. The past 4 games for Barkley, 5, 10, 8, and 5 targets, and that's really valuable to have for running back. So I'd agree. If anything, it'd be worth trying to add Saquon to your roster right now via trade. Chris Long is asking, lost Hooper, do I add Goddard, Witten, or stick with Noah Fant and pray for the best? You've been banging the Dallas Goddard drum for a long time now, and now Deshaun Jackson is done for the year. Does that make Goddard a higher priority over Jason Witten and Noah Fant?
Yeah, I think so. Dallas Goedert basically has seen his snap rate increase week over week over the last month and a half. He's running more routes. I know Zach Ertz, the last time we saw this Philadelphia team, Zach Ertz was the one who benefited, but all of the peripheral numbers were still there for Dallas Goedert. I think that we're looking at a scenario where Goddard could realistically be a low-end tight end 1 from here on out, just given the landscape of the position. But, I don't think this is that big of a hot take, but I think Dallas Goedert as a receiver has just more inherent upside than Zach Ertz has. Zach Ertz, more of that Jason Witten type, not someone who's going to, be a highlight reel type player, but he's very reliable. Whereas Dallas Goedert is this athletic freak who has a lot of touchdown upside. So I think he's very, very interesting, especially with Deshaun Jackson now dealing with the injury.
And the Eagles said going into their bye week that they are going to experiment with their wide receivers, but that would likely not lead to less Dallas Goedert. If anything, it could lead to more because they've been good when he's been on the field. So I think that Dallas Goedert's floor is actually better than perception. And as you said multiple times, his ceiling is pretty good too. Brad Senger is wondering, off of his big game, can we trust Darius Slayton in that Giants offense? Now, Slayton obviously did ball out, 13 targets on Sunday, but that was also with Evan Engram and Sterling Shepard out. Sterling Shepard, we probably shouldn't assume will be back at all this year, but Evan Engram very well could be. So what is your overall view on Darius Slayton right now?
Yeah, look, it was a good matchup. It was a good circumstances for Slayton, but at the same time, he wasn't a bad prospect either. I actually liked him a decent bit coming out. He's a vertical threat, which is something that they definitely need on that team in general, with Evan Engram and Golden Tate and Saquon Barkley being their primary targets. Those are guys that won't necessarily catch a ton of deep balls. Darius Slayton has that ability to get down the field. He saw a massive target share this past week. But without Sterling Shepard, as you mentioned, we don't know exactly what's going to go down with his situation. And maybe Evan Engram doesn't come back as quickly as we think. So I think that he's definitely worth an add. And I bet you can get somewhat of a discount for him this week just because they are on a bye.
Exactly, because a lot of times people will sort by projections for the upcoming week or something like that, and they just won't see guys who are on a bye. So I think that you're not going to have to spend a whole lot to get Slayton, and the upside there, if Evan Engram does miss additional games, obviously is quite high. Dylan Lighty asks, and this is a start-sit question, and because it's Tuesday, we don't tend to do a whole lot of start-sit, but this game is on Thursday. So I guess broadly, he wants to know who the better plays this week between Odell Beckham and Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, I think that it's worthwhile to discuss these two more broadly because people who have them on their teams probably pretty frustrated with both guys. So which one do you favor between those two, let's say rest of season, rather than just in week number 11?
I mean, I think you can make the argument that it's OBJ for both. If you look at OBJ's peripherals, they're still there. He still has about 26% of the team's targets, which is a great target share. He just hasn't been able to find the end zone. Some of that has to do with Cleveland having a skewed pass to rush touchdown ratio. Baker Mayfield underperforming in the touchdown column given the amount of yards that he has. I do worry about the matchup though a little bit. The Steelers have been lights out since Minkah Fitzpatrick was traded to the Steelers. They're actually allowing just 10.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks when the quarterbacks that they've faced have averaged over 17 fantasy points per game. So they're playing way above expectation. They've only allowed 2 top 24 performances to wide receivers since the Minkah deal. But I would argue that matchup wise, he won't necessarily see, it's not like he's playing in the slot a whole bunch or anything like that where Minkah might be lined up a little bit more. But regardless, it's a tough matchup. There's gonna be a lot of pressure going at Baker Mayfield. I still would prefer OBJ in this matchup though. If you look at what the Steelers have done with Juju, over the first 5 weeks versus the last 5 weeks, if you look at team positional target share, the biggest drop in any positional group in the league has been with the Steelers wide receivers in target share. And a lot of that has to do with the quarterback change and just general philosophy of this team where they're dumping the ball off a lot to guys like Jalen Samuels. And that's hurt Juju Smith-Schuster. He has a sub 17% target share in each of his last 2 games. I just don't know how you can confidently trust Juju moving forward. So to me, I'm buying volume above anything else, and OBJ would be my pick.
And I think that even though Odell Beckham has not returned what you spent to get him this year, he's still been better than perception. He still has at least 5 receptions for 50 yards in every game except for 2 this year. And for a floor for a wide receiver, that's really not that bad. And you get the additional upside of is having a ceiling too once he gets in better matchups. He has faced some really tough matchups here recently against New England, Denver, and Buffalo, all really talented cornerbacks there. And things do open up after the Steeler game. So this floor has been good, and the ceiling could come back here pretty soon. Dylan Lighty asked, is Joe Mixon a solid RB2 the rest of the way? Joe Mixon got a ton of volume in their first game with Ryan Finley at quarterback, but he also has Ryan Finley as his quarterback. So what's your view of Joe Mixon going forward?
Yeah, and you've had some issues with Gio Bernard too. I think that's somewhat of a concern for Joe Mixon, but they definitely wanted to establish the run regardless of the fact that they were down by like 45 points in the second quarter in that game. So I think that's at least a good sign, but he's still not being heavily utilized as a receiver. His target share was still, I think, around the 10% mark this past week. We haven't really seen that blow up game from a usage standpoint through the air. Is he an RB2 moving forward? Sure. I think anyone seeing a lot of volume in fantasy football running back could be considered an RB2. Is he someone that I think has a really high ceiling? No, I don't think that he has that RB1 type ceiling. So if you can find someone who is an RB2, that has that baseline volume, but actually has that ceiling, I'd prefer them over Joe Mixon. So I think the best way to describe Mixon moving forward is that he's fine.
Yeah, he has a very small range of outcomes, and that's not a positive. Sometimes it's good to be consistent. It's not good to be consistent when the upside is pretty limited. I think that's the case with Joe Mixon. Alec wants to know, tight ends are super thin. Any sleeper tight end pickups for the rest of the year? We've been talking about Dallas Goedert for several weeks now. So I think that if you're watching this, you probably know that Dallas Goedert is someone that JJ would target out on waiver wires. Anybody else who kind of stands out to you as being a tight end who's pretty widely available, who may have some appeal for the rest of the way?
Yeah, I mean, you could look at what happened last night in last night's game and look at Jacob Hollister. That's especially true with Tyler Lockett now banged up. We don't know there's a lot of ambiguity around that injury right now, but Tyler Lockett playing a lot of snaps from the slot. A lot of those looks could hypothetically go to the tight end position. It's not like there's a ton of competition for targets for Seattle. So I think Hollister is one that jumps to my mind as someone that's lower owned that you could probably pick up. And then another one is Dawson Knox. He ran a decent amount of routes this past week. I actually think he's a decent streamer this week. So he's someone, I think he's only rostered in about 5% of Yahoo leagues. He's someone who would probably be on your waiver wire as well.
One other guy who's had an interesting role recently has been Irv Smith of the Vikings. Yeah. We've seen Kyle Rudolph score a bunch of touchdowns and had a 2-point conversion, but Irv Smith also had 6 targets in that game. It's kind of this similar situation with what we had with Dallas Goedert, though, where we're questioning, is he getting usage because Adam Thielen is out? And Adam Thielen could be back soon, which would mean that Irv Smith's role will be in flux. But Irv Smith, the past 4 games, 6, 3, 6, and 6 targets. The snap rates have been good there, too. So keep an eye on Adam Thielen. And if Thielen can't go, I think that Irv Smith could be someone you could consider as a desperation play at tight end. Lincoln Wettenhall wants to know, is anyone on the Bengals worth rostering anymore? Should I give up on Tyler Boyd? It's been frustrating for Tyler Boyd so far this year. The market shares have not been what we expected. Now Ryan Finley is starting. We kind of discussed Joe Mixon, but what about the Bengals wide receivers? Any interest for you in those guys? Are they withholding due to volume, or are you looking elsewhere?
I'd probably mostly look elsewhere. I mean, Tyler Boyd's volume's been okay enough, but with an offense that's that inept, it's kind of difficult to trust week in and week out. I think the only guy that I would really confidently play, and I'm not even that confident playing him, would be Joe Mixon.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way to view it, because even we've seen Tyler Boyd get decent volume, it's been sporadic. It hasn't always been consistent that he would get, crazy target volume. Because, he had 8 targets last week, 9 and 14, but it's also going to be a team that wants to run the football with Ryan Finley being, for as long as they can at least, with Ryan Finley at quarterback. And the efficiency in those targets probably not going to be that great. So I think it's hard for me to trust anyone there either. Corey Sherman wants to know, any strong players to stash or target for the fantasy playoffs? You've referenced a couple of guys, fantasy playoff schedule already. You mentioned Saquon Barkley as having a strong playoff schedule. Anybody else stand out to you as someone you would want to have for that stretch run during the playoffs?
Jacksonville's passing attack is really intriguing. Weeks 15 and 16, they get Atlanta and Oakland. So you could look hypothetically at Nick Foles if you need a streaming quarterback. But I think DJ Chark and specifically D.D. Westbrook, who hasn't really been that great this year, but he did show some rapport in the preseason. Limited action, very small sample size. He only played one preseason game. But in that game when Nick Foles was under center, D.D. Westbrook saw 7 targets. And it was in, I believe, just the first half. It was just basically Nick Foles either dumping it off to Leonard Fournette or throwing it in the slot to D.D. Westbrook. And I do think he scored a touchdown in that game as well. So D.D. Westbrook is kind of interesting. And then if you can somehow buy low on Chris Godwin right now, I think that's a really strong call. He's been iffy over the last 3 weeks. But he's still been fine. He hasn't been, awful. He's still seen at least 20% of Tampa Bay's targets over that time. And they have a pretty favorable playoff schedule as well. So I like Godwin as a buy low, as someone who could be, a true wide receiver 1 once you hit the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we're at the point in the year where schedules, we kind of know which defenses are good and which are not. So they are more relevant now than they are earlier in the season. I think that does allow you to take a look at those, see which guys may be in good spots, and kind of plan accordingly. Moises Beltran wants to know, can you please recommend a quarterback streamer? Love the Late Round Podcast, by the way. Thanks. So thank you, Moises. And make sure you subscribe to the Late Round Podcast wherever you get your podcasts as well. Favorite quarterback streamer for this week, JJ?
I like Kyle Allen a lot going up against Atlanta. I know Atlanta looked a lot better defensively this past week, but we see that kind of stuff a lot in the NFL where there's these one-game anomalies. New Orleans coming off their bye, maybe they didn't feel right and they weren't together enough. I don't know. These things just kind of happen. But if you look at it objectively, Panthers are at home. It's a high over-under game. They're favorites in that game, which gives them a pretty high implied team total. And Atlanta's been beatable in their secondary all season long, maybe aside from last week. But even last week, to a degree, they were still beat. So I like Kyle Allen in that matchup. I think he's probably the top traditional streamer this week.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Kyle Allen has showed at times this year that he can be viable in the right matchups. And Atlanta, about as right of a matchup as you can possibly have. Bethany Peters wants to know, rest of season, pick up Matt Ryan or Phillip Rivers. Looking at this week, Matt Ryan is facing Carolina on the road, which is a pretty tough spot, but he's been a solid quarterback all year long. Whereas Phillip Rivers is down in Mexico and facing off with the Chiefs. That should be a pretty high-scoring game. I believe the total in that game is 52.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Do you think that either of them is a plug-and-play for the rest of the year, or are you just playing this one based on the weekly matchups?
Yeah, I think it's more weekly matchups, but I would prefer, if I were to pick one straight up, I'd prefer Matt Ryan over Phillip Rivers. Rivers really just has not looked good / produced over the last few weeks. That whole offense hasn't really been that strong. The passing attack hasn't since the beginning of the season. So I think Matt Ryan is the safer pick between the two. And you're also buying into the weapons a little bit there. Hopefully Austin Hooper can get healthy. But obviously Julio Jones is Julio Jones. So and Calvin Ridley's not a bad number 2. So I think that I feel a little bit more confident with Matt Ryan than Phillip Rivers.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Matt Ryan has had tough matchups this year and has still been very good. So that's not a huge detriment to him necessarily. Chris Wood says, broad question. Do you aim to stack quarterback and wide receiver / running back when you're a big underdog, or is that misguided? In the context he gives, I am a big lawn shock this week due to buys and bad luck. I've got Wentz and Garoppolo, considering dropping Jimmy G for either Carr or Allen to stack with Tyrell Williams / Jacobs or Curtis Samuel. So ignoring the specifics here, broadly, are you trying to stack a quarterback with his wide receiver and running back when you know you need to score a lot of points in a given week?
Yeah, I mean, look, we do it in DFS all the time, right? That's the go-to strat. You have to basically do it if you're trying to win a tournament. And the reason we do that is because it's high variance. Obviously, it can force your team to perform really poorly because if that stack doesn't pan out, then your team's kind of screwed. But then the opposite happens, and you can hit on a tournament or you can score a lot of points. So I think it's fine as long as, and this is more from a season-long perspective, you just have to be as optimal as possible. Because if you're dropping someone like Lamar Jackson, I don't know, someone random like that, who's good at the quarterback position and is a plug and play and give you a high ceiling regardless, but maybe isn't as stackable for someone like Derek Carr or Kyle Allen, that's being suboptimal. That's not being that smart. It's not like Jimmy Garoppolo is someone who's this plug and play, you got to play him type of quarterback. So I think as a result, yeah, you can look at Derek Carr, you can look at Kyle Allen, whichever one you feel more comfortable with.
Yeah, I think it makes sense if you're trying to break ties. Like if you have a running back or a running back on one team and a running back on another who are tied to a quarterback and you want to go for the upside, it makes sense to use that as a tiebreaker. But I think that if you're going to operate in a super, suboptimal fashion, you're kind of just lowering your odds of hitting that high end too. You do have to consider ceiling within the individual player as well. Like you don't want to use a non-involved player on the team just to get that stack. So I think that, keep that in mind and make sure you're not lowering yourself too much. But if you're breaking ties or it's pretty similar, I think it does make sense there to favor the stack. Heather wants to know, is Sam Darnold worth a pickup for the rest of the season? Sam Darnold gets Washington this week, and it's a good matchup, but Washington games tend to be very low scoring because Bill Callahan is firmly on team establish the run. Darnold's schedule good after that as well, though. So what do you think about Sam Darnold as being a quarterback for fantasy the rest of the way?
Yeah, look, the way that I view quarterback in general, I think a lot of people want there to be these quarterbacks that you can just plug and play and not have to worry about it for the rest of the season. There's maybe 5 or 6 of them in the NFL right now. And that's the way that it is every season. Some seasons there's only 2 or 3 of them. This year there's at least a decent number of them. But I don't think Sam Darnold, even though the matchups are good because we've seen him perform poorly in good matchups, I don't think Sam Darnold is a plug and play guy. I think that he's a streamer who you can utilize this week. I still like Kyle Allen, for instance, more than Sam Darnold this week. But he's a streamer. He's viable. But I highly doubt that he's going to be someone who's going to give you, top 8 or so numbers, which is basically what you need because you know that you can stream the position better than that. I don't think he's going to be one of those players.
And the odds that he hits that top end are also lower in a lower scoring game, which is what we should expect against Washington because, again, they just want to run the football. They want to keep games low scoring. They want to, not overexpose Dwayne Haskins. So, it makes sense what they're doing, but it just is not good for fantasy. And that does lower Sam Darnold's appeal and the appeal in Le'Veon Bell, Robbie Anderson, Jamison Crowder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although it is a Jamison Crowder revenge game. So we should keep that in mind for this week. We haven't got a question about this yet, JJ, but I did want to get your thoughts on the Browns running back situation because we did finally get some data on this. And I thought the data was honestly as good as it possibly could have been. Yeah. Nick Chubb, 80% of the snaps, Kareem Hunt, 58%. They played together a bunch. Kareem Hunt was basically a fullback on a lot of plays. And Chubb still ran 27 routes while Hunt ran 23, according to Pro Football Focus. Those are really good numbers. So we've talked about these two guys quite a bit throughout the year. What are your thoughts on those two guys going forward now that we actually have a sample on them playing together?
Yeah, look, I think Chubb might end up maintaining his value overall. Maybe be dinged just a little bit from a receiving perspective because I don't know if we can just count on Kareem Hunt's usage being what it was this past week in and week out. Especially considering he had like a 23% target share in that game. He's not gonna keep that up. But at the same time, yeah, I mean it's encouraging because Kareem Hunt lined up wide. He was in the slot a little bit. He played all over the field. So he could realistically be a flex play moving forward, especially in PPR formats, whereas Nick Chubb probably a firm RB1 still moving forward, just assuming that he does indeed see goal line work, which I know that they couldn't find the end zone at the goal line this past week, but Nick Chubb was seeing all of the goal line work. He just couldn't score. So I think Nick Chubb is still an RB1 and Kareem Hunt more in that maybe high end in PPR formats, high end RB3 maybe.
Yeah, and the good thing, too, with the Browns is that they were effective in those personnel packages where they had both Hunt and Chubb out there, which I think bodes well for what we should expect from them going forward. So I don't see any reason for Cleveland to deviate from that. That's great for Nick Chubb. And honestly, his snap rate went up 20 percentage points from where it was in Week 9, which is wild. But it really does bode well for him down the stretch. They've got the Steeler game coming up, but after that, Cleveland's schedule actually opens up quite a bit.
Sure does.
And it's really encouraging. And I think that means we can potentially buy into more pieces in this offense than just Nick Chubb. Now, again, we don't really have a ton of data on this yet, but is this a situation where you could see yourself actually actively trying to get Nick Chubb, buying him, trying to trade for him, or is he more of just a hold rather than being a sell, which he potentially could have been in the scenario?
Yeah, probably more of a hold. If you were to ask me this 2 weeks ago and you would say, who do you want more rest of season, Alvin Kamara or Nick Chubb? I think it would be an easy lean Alvin Kamara. And I still think it would be Alvin Kamara from here on out. But even still, yeah, I mean, I think that Nick Chubb's outlook looks a lot rosier after this past week, just given the fact that we were able to see both these guys on the field instead of Kareem Hunt coming onto the field with Nick Chubb leaving the field.
Is there anything else from this Cleveland offense? Because I think that they've been one who people have been pretty frustrated with, I would say, throughout this entire year. We've seen Jarvis Landry get some pretty good usage, though. We talked about OBJ. Have you seen enough from Cleveland in their tough games to actually trust them once we get into the tougher games for them or the easier games for them as well?
I think OBJ is somewhat of a buy. And the way that I look at it, in 2 of their next 3 games, they're facing Pittsburgh. And those are should be 2 tough games. But they get Miami, they get Arizona. There's some other cake matchups in there leading up through the fantasy playoffs. OBJ's peripherals are all there. If we were to remove the narrative and everything that's going on with the Browns right now, and we just look at what OBJ is producing, he, like I said earlier, he's got over a 26% target share this year. He's a big positive touchdown regression candidate based on his yardage total and even just his general usage. So I think OBJ, if you're a team right now that's looking to the playoffs and, you don't necessarily absolutely need a win over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think OBJ is probably a good buy right now because there's the possibility that he has a good game against Pittsburgh, which would then raise his price. Right. Obviously he could not, and then his price would be lowered more. But regardless, the usage is there, the matchups upcoming are there, and there's some positive touchdown regression coming for not only OBJ, but that whole passing attack. If you look at Baker Mayfield's yardage totals, he's one of the bigger positive regression candidates as well. I think he's scored or thrown about 4 or 5 fewer touchdowns than he should have based on his yardage total so far this year. So I'm not necessarily buying into Baker because the quarterback position doesn't matter that much in fantasy. But yeah, if you want to go after a guy like OBJ, Jarvis Landry's been a positive touchdown regression candidate all season long. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that with Beckham, you could look at this Browns offense and see that they've lowered their time to throw. They're trying to get the ball out of Baker's hands quickly, which makes sense given their offensive line issues. But even with that being said, we've seen Beckham still get 2, 3, 1, and 3 deep targets the past 4 games. He's still getting downfield work, and the big games will come. So I think that Beckham does make a lot of sense. Question here from Justin, is Kenny Stills worth rostering with the return of Will Fuller? Will Fuller able to practice this week? Don't know for sure whether he'll be able to go, but we've got a roster crunch here for sure. We're trying to add handcuffs, as you mentioned before. Is Kenny still someone you'd be consider dropping now that Will Fuller seems like he'd be back if you need that bench spot?
If you can get a handcuff, a high-end handcuff for Kenny Stills, I think it's fine. That's probably the direction that I would go in, mostly because we've seen Kenny Stills without Will Fuller over the last few weeks, and he hasn't been incredibly fantasy relevant. And then we've seen the target share in that offense shift to guys like Duke Johnson. Duke Johnson has seen his target share jump a good bit over the last month or so. So yeah, it makes sense that Kenny Stills is going to be dinged a whole lot. And it's not like he was all that relevant even with Fuller out.
Right. And Darren Fells has played a lot more snaps, too. They've gone with more 2 tight end sets. That's taken away some of the appeal from Kenny Stills. So my boy Kenny Thrills will come back to you another day. Bethany Peters wants to know, Minnesota defense facing Brandon Allen at home this week, which sounds intriguing to me, or sticking with New Orleans since they have a good schedule for a few games. Now, New Orleans is on the road facing Tampa Bay, and road defenses are scary. Now, Marshawn Lattimore is banged up, but we could see an uptick for New Orleans after that. So would you drop New Orleans to pick up Minnesota, given that Minnesota, at least in my eyes, is the preferred matchup in week number 11?
Yeah, I'm looking at the Saints schedule right now. It's not favorable enough, I don't think, to warrant a move like that. They get Carolina, then they get the Falcons, and they get the 49ers. Those aren't that great of matchups for a defense necessarily. I think you can stream just as well as that. So I would just go with the 1 week look and just go with Minnesota. I think they're the better match. They're the better play this week.
10-point favorites at home against a quarterback who had not started an NFL game before 2 weeks ago. I think that bodes pretty well for the Minnesota defense. That is all the time that we have for today for this FanDuel Waiver Wire Facebook Live Q&A. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and asking your questions. If you did not get your question answered, JJ will be back with you on Sunday to answer your start-sit questions right here, same time at noon Eastern on Facebook Live. JJ, what else do you have going on until we get to Sunday?
Yeah, it's another usual week for me, the Late Round Podcast. I dropped the 15 Transactions show today. Tomorrow we'll have the 10 Trends show, then a matchup show, and then the mailbag show. So 4 episodes this week as usual. You can find that anywhere podcasts can be found. Just search for the Late Round Podcast.
We'll have our DFS Week 11 preview going up on Thursday morning as well with myself and Brandon Gadula. You can find that by searching for the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. Preview podcast every Thursday, recap podcast every Monday, and also streaming those now on the FanDuel YouTube page. So you can check those out live 9 a.m. Monday and 10 a.m. on Thursday. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for running the video side of things here today. Thank you, as always, Cal, for doing that. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and asking your questions. Good luck with those waiver wires tonight. And we'll talk to you once again on Sunday. This has been the FanDuel Waiver Wire Q&A on Facebook Live.